Mass censorship on social media platforms and an expansion of national security powers to fight extremists and domestic terrorists is what Glenn Greenwald is identifying as the beginning of a disempowering of anyone who dissents from the current agenda.
Journalist and co-founding editor of The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, joins us now to discuss the looming new domestic war on terror. Great to see you, Glenn.
Good to see you, Glenn.
Good to be with you guys.
I just saw a headline this morning. They're planning to leave thousands of National Guardsmen in the nation's capital now because of the impeachment trial is the justification that's being used here. What are some of the signs that you are seeing here that are troubling to you?
Well, anytime the government deploys its military into its own streets against its own citizens, it's an act of extreme power on the part of the government. It's something that we generally really think ought to be avoided. And I think the thing that's most chilling about it to me is that, remember, it was only 6 months ago that Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed in the New York Times advocating that troops be deployed onto American streets against American citizens in order to quell the protests and riots that had broken out for months in multiple cities around the country after George Floyd's murder. And that view was considered not just misguided, but so evil, the idea that there should be troops in the U.S. streets, that two editors at the New York Times were forced out of their jobs simply for having aired this view. And now 6 months later, we're not just having a senator advocate the deployment of troops. We have thousands and thousands of troops in the nation's capital with no end date for when they're going to go home, with extremely amorphous justifications about why they're there. And most people seem fine with it. So it just shows you how potent fear-mongering is when the media unites to propagate it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I am concerned about, Glenn, is that you also see the president now, Joe Biden, calling, or at least seeming amenable to new domestic terror laws and more. What would that even entail? Because that's the thing I don't understand. What current law was not sufficient to stop the Capitol attacks? As I understand it, 100 more cops and the entire thing looks different.
Of course. I mean, of course, the United States, the most militarized country in the world, the most paramilitarized police force in the world, has the capacity to repel a few hundred protesters from the Capitol had they been prepared to do so, which is why talk that we're facing some kind of existential insurrection is utter lunacy and madness, clearly designed to exploit people's fears to justify greater powers. But obviously the model they're using, and they're saying it explicitly, is what they did with the first war on terror, the one that was ostensibly devoted to foreign terrorist groups on other soil besides U.S. soil, though it ended up infiltrating U.S. soil as well, was to expand what it means to be a crime. Obviously, before 2001, it was already a crime to fly planes into buildings or to blow people up. Those were already crimes. So they had to enact an entire series of new terrorism laws that were designed to expand what it means to support terrorism, and they called it material support for terrorism, which ended up being, if you were a Muslim and you uploaded a video critical of U.S. foreign policy and heralding people who were resisting, or if you donated money to a charity that indirectly ended up in the hands of groups that the United States government, with no due process, designated as a terrorist organization, even if it wasn't your intent, you were prosecuted for materially supporting terrorist organizations. What this law does, that Adam Schiff proposed, is to simply take the existing war on terror law that is devoted to foreign terrorist groups and just amend it to say, and domestic terror groups as well, which means criminalizing all kinds of protest, associational, and even speech activities. Because as you say, Sagar, doing things like beating a police officer to death with a fire extinguisher or plotting how to violently attack the U.S. government, those are already felonies. Exactly. You don't need new laws. You only need new laws if you want to really regulate core political activity, which of course is what they want to do.
Right.
Talk to me about the politics of this, because you highlighted Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and other progressives joined together in a letter in opposition to this new domestic terror law. Presumably, there may be some sort of libertarians on the right who may also join in with this type of effort to block new domestic terror laws. Where do you think the politics of this stand, and what do we know about the Biden administration's openness to these moves?
The Wall Street Journal reported right after the Capitol riot that it was a, quote, priority for the Biden administration to usher in new domestic terrorism laws. They were looking to do that even before the Capitol event happened. The law that I referenced proposed by Adam Schiff was proposed in 2019. So almost 2 years before what happened at the Capitol. It's just like the neocons wanted to invade Iraq long before 9/11 and then got to use 9/11 as the pretext to do it. So I do think it's so interesting and notable that the people who first stood up on the left to object to this were people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who have a very personal relationship to the abuses and excesses of the first war on terror. And the last thing they want to see is having the FBI and the CIA and the NSA further empowered to do what they did in the first war on terror, now do it domestically in the second, because they're smart enough to know that the people that they may want to be targeted aren't necessarily the people who will be targeted if you empower these domestic law enforcement organizations to do these sorts of things. You look at their history, as the letter Rashida Tlaib pointed out. Every time you increase the power of the FBI in the name of combating a domestic enemy, it's turned into serious repression. So I think that's the one thing that leaves me hopeful, is there is this left-wing flank, the squad. 5 of the 6 members signed that letter. The only one who didn't was Cori Bush, and others like Barbara Lee did as well. Definitely can work with people on the right and in Republican politics who are also very wary of what this is about.
And what I think I fear the most, though, Glenn, is that it's possible, but that's still a very nascent coalition. And of course, there are a lot of establishment Republicans who would be very happy to go along with this, empower the security state, give more contracts out to many of their donors and more. What is the backlash to this? What kind of backlash could manifest itself in our politics if we allow this sort of criminalization and militarization to continue into our domestic sphere?
I don't know that there is much backlash right now. And I mean, you're absolutely right. If the Democrats lose 15 progressive members of the House, they'll easily replace those with Liz Cheney and her friends.
Exactly.
Go look at how liberals are talking about Liz Cheney. When Kevin McCarthy was talking about possibly removing her from the House, they're talking like she's the savior of the Republican Party. She's like a hero to American liberals now. And she has this little posse. I watched it in the House Armed Services Committee, where she joined with the pro-war Democrats to roll over that little coalition of Ro Khanna and Tulsi Gabbard on the left and Matt Gaetz on the right, saying, let's bring troops home from Afghanistan and Germany. They blocked them. They had a majority. The emotions surrounding what happened at the Capitol are so high that anybody who stands up and questions whether or not we need a new war on terror to combat it is instantly accused of sympathy for white supremacy or neo-nationalism or insurrectionist revolution, just like people who stood up and questioned the war on terror in 2001, 2, and 3 were accused of sympathy toward Islamic radicalism. It's the same tactic and the same result.
Yeah.
All right. On a separate issue, have to ask you, you were trending on Twitter over the weekend because you apparently got a New York Times editor fired, or at least that's what your critics are saying. Just to give people the backstory, you tweeted out some sort of mild mocking of this woman, Lauren Wolf, who's an editor at the New York Times, because she said the Biden plane landing on Inauguration Day gave her chills. And now the New York Times, for reasons we don't actually know why, has fired her. What do you think of all of this one?
I mean, I've been trying to tell people for a long time, including the two of you, that where I'm concerned, you all need to behave yourself, because I do have the power to have anyone fired simply with a single tweet. It doesn't even reference firing. It doesn't reference anyone losing their job. Simply the slightest wiggle of my finger will result in immediate termination by the nation's most powerful institutions like the New York Times. Even though you might think the New York Times hates me, they do take marching orders directly from my Twitter feed. I think that's been obvious for a long time. Hopefully people will see that now. I think that what is really going on here is that, people liked the political sentiment that she expressed, and they're angry that she got fired. No one even knows why she was fired. She says she got fired. And by the way, she wasn't even fired. She didn't work for the New York Times. She didn't even have a contract. She apparently was just like a informal freelancer. And the New York Times said, we didn't terminate our relationship with her because of this tweet. We terminated it for other reasons that we're not at liberty to discuss because it involves. So all of Twitter spent 24 hours attaching itself to an insane narrative that was based on, at best, a baseless view of what happened, if not an outright false one, namely that she was fired for that tweet, and absolute lunacy that the New York Times did it because I mildly critiqued her tweet. I didn't even critique her tweet. I was just using that tweet to mock the media's swooning for Joe Biden. The idea that I was somehow responsible for it is just the sort of thing that can only exist in a social media mob, which is one good reason why social media mobs shouldn't decide things. So
who's next on the chopping block, Glenn?
Yeah.
Whose head are you going to take off today?
I got to think about how I felt about this interview. It very well could be one of you two.
That's true.
But I might continue my role with New York Times reporters as well. It seems, I don't know, I'm kind of drunk with power on that as well. So
keep them guessing.
Well, I got a list. I'll send it over your way. All right, Glenn.
All right,
Thanks,
please do.
Glenn. Good
Thanks,
to see you.
All right, good to be with you guys.
Coming up, what President Biden and Governor Cuomo have to say about the virus that's been rising continues.